All right, let's get the show started. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining. Welcome to InRhythm Lightning Talks. I'm your host, Parag Katkar. I'm the head of consulting practices at InRhythm, and we have a lot of exciting lightning talks lined up for you in the upcoming weeks. Our lightning talks are hosted every Thursday at 5:15 p.m. Eastern Time. And each week, one of our practice area consultants shares their knowledge on the evolving technology trends in the industry. This week, Mike Sellitto, who is a senior software engineer with us, is going to give us an overview of CI/CD for package developers. I'm really looking forward to hearing the best industry practices that he's going to present it to us. And without further ado, let's get it started, Mike.
Awesome. Thanks, Parag. Hello, everyone. I am Mike Sellitto. I am a software engineer here at InRhythm. Today, I'm going to be giving an overview, I guess, of CI/CD, which I'll get into what that is, specifically for package developers and kind of what that entails and how it might differ from CI/CD in a normal project. So first, let's talk about what is CI/CD. I'm going to assume for the sake of this talk that we're all familiar with continuous integration, continuous deployment, but I do want to kind of break this down. So we've got continuous integration, continuous delivery, and then after that, we've got continuous deployment. But for the sake of this talk, just to kind of give a heads up, I'm going to assume we know how a lot of these things work, or we might have some kind of working knowledge of what goes on. Okay, yeah, I know tests are run. Maybe I'm not the one writing all of the tests, or this goes up to Jenkins or some other CI tool for a build. And you might not know exactly how all of that works. That's okay. But in this talk, what I'm really going to focus on is kind of how these things kind of come together and some really important, I think, tips, things that I've learned in my mistakes or I've seen others learn in their mistakes, and also just some kind of industry trends that I think are really important. So first, we can see this is what they call maybe the DevOps life cycle here, and it's laid out flat. And the CI or continuous integration piece talks about coding, building, and testing. And then the continuous delivery piece is where we kind of have some testing, and also the release and then deployment. And I'll talk about the difference between a release and a deploy later on. But so we're really going to be focusing on these steps and just some things that I've picked up about each of these stages of the software development lifecycle. So first, the first step we saw was code. And these are some things that I think are really important. And first, when you're coming up with tooling or any type of pipeline, I think it's very important to support developer choice in tools. And what do I mean by that? I mean, you should really avoid any decision that is going to limit, for instance, what text editor your developers can use. If you decide you really want this tool and the only way to use it is with an extension for VS Code, me, along with a lot of other developers, we're not people who use VS Code as our text editor. And I honestly hate to be opened up to VS Code. So, I think it's good to avoid using tools that limit your developers and instead make decisions that are kind of agnostic of what your developers are using to get their work done. So here's where unit tests happen in this stage. You're developing your package and you're iterating on your code and your tests are running consistently. But to quote Dan Abramov from the React team, he once said that rerunning a test you're actively iterating on after a file change shouldn't take more than a second. And I totally agree with this. Anytime a developer is sitting there waiting for something to happen is wasted time. And if all of the tests that are being run on every file change are taking more than a second, it's probably a good idea to move those to a later stage of the pipeline. Finally, I think one thing that's really important for every developer, but especially package developers, that is to learn to write good commit messages and encourage your team members to do so. So I have, at the end of this talk, there is a helpful links section, and I've got a really nice article that outlines this, using the correct verbiage and also kind of some of the ins and outs of just getting your team consistent with commit messages. It can really help. So the next stage we're going to talk about is the build stage. So you can use lots of different tools for this. Jenkins, Circle CI, and GitLab are some. I've got their logos up here. But whatever tool you use, the concepts are the same. I think it's important to utilize zero bounce builds, or ZBB. You might have seen this acronym and not really know what it was. Something might have marked one of your pull requests as a decline because it decided that it didn't build. And I think this should happen on every single PR. So every single pull request, anytime you want to make a change, something should automatically just be making sure at least that your code builds. Because if you have a syntax error and something's not even going to compile, there's no reason for anybody to look at that code. So that's, having something automatically tell you that you've made a mistake like that is important. Sometimes, it's not as simple as, oh, I made a syntax error. It might be that you forgot to reinstall dependencies after changing some things, and just because it was working on your machine and you submit the PR with those changes, it might not actually work in the versions that you guys are using in production. So second thing is that these builds should be happening in the cloud. You should be utilizing things like Jenkins, GitLab, Circle CI. Having to manually do all of these build processes, especially when you're building a package and you have tons of other dependencies, wasting developer time should be avoided at all costs. And if you're forcing developers to build things locally, you're probably wasting a lot of time. So that's that point there. And going along with that, I also think it is, though, important to encourage the developers on your team to learn how to use whatever CI tool it is that you've picked for your package. And that's because, sometimes it's, you might have a build fail, and it's not always such a straightforward error. Being able to go and read the error logs and the logs on Jenkins or the logs on GitLab, and at least have some idea of what's going on. Maybe you have to edit a Groovy file for Jenkins to make sure it's running the correct commands prior to your build so that it's fetching data correctly, or whatever the case is. If every member of your team can do that, it saves you all a lot of time having to reach out to another team, some DevOps team that, might not always have the time to help you in that moment. And so this is all about reducing friction. The next stage is kind of the test stage. And here's, all the different DevOps diagrams will throw testing in here. Here, I think they're really talking a lot about like integration testing and like running a test suite that might take 10 minutes, 5 minutes, depending on what it is that you're testing. But in these cases, obviously, these should happen in the cloud, but this is where a lot of that happens. But just speaking about testing, it also happens at all of the other steps, essentially, of the of the CI/CD process. And so one thing that I've picked up on, I've heard other developers talk about it, and I think this is my personal opinion, but I think it's the right one. And that is that test-driven development in its literal form, which is you should write all of your tests to the spec before you're actually writing the code that you're going to be testing. I think that's bad and annoying, specifically because we all know that when you decide you're going to write a function or build a component or whatever the case is, it's not always the case that you know exactly how it's going to work when it is in its final form. And very often, more often than not, we end up changing functionality as part of the development process as we're discovering more about what it is that we set out to accomplish. And sometimes, if you haven't followed test-driven development literally, that means you change it in one spot and you get to figure everything out and then write your tests later on. But if you followed test-driven development literally, now you not only have to change the code you're writing, but also change every single test that you've written before. And you also might have written some bad tests that were never going to pass. So, I think test-driven development should always be taken with a grain of salt. Although that being said, testing is an extremely important part of developing any package or any software. And I do think that this shouldn't be taken to mean that I think testing is bad. I just think writing all of your tests before your code is, again, I'll say it one last time, bad and annoying. So the next stage is the release stage. So not to be confused with deployment, which I'll talk about in a minute. Releases don't always go to your end users, right? So releases are going to happen. I think they should happen somewhere on every merge, whether it's to master, to staging, development, or your working branch. Anytime somebody's merging code that has been reviewed by your peers and okayed, it should trigger some release to some channel, whether that's a nightly channel, like some beta channel, work in progress channel, whatever you call it. By doing so, or if you have every night, you have a nightly release, if you want to take that term literally, this will allow your team and other teams to test the changes you're making to your package prior to the deployment to production. And this can be huge, very important. And sometimes people will try to get fancy and do things like, oh, I'll make a separate package for my beta. And I really don't think that's the way to go, because you're asking every user of your package to update all of their import statements, go through their own headache when it comes to making updates or using the test version going back to the production version. So I really think it's important to just utilize channels of your package releases, and you can do so with versioning. So this leads to my next point, which is to use semantic versioning always in package development specifically. I don't think that's the case with all types of development or software releases, but for package development or library development, anytime you're releasing to other developers and you have a public API, and by public, that doesn't necessarily mean to the general public. It could just mean to your company or to your vendors. Anytime you have an API of some sort, I think it's really important to use semantic versioning. And that's because somebody should be able to look at your version number and the version number they have installed and know if updating from their version to your version is going to break their code. And semantic versioning allows for that. And I do have a link later on to semver.org where you can read more about the semantic versioning spec. So that does lead to my next point, which is to write good release notes, make them pretty, and automatically generate them. Don't write them out by hand at release time. So although with semantic versioning, right, we're not going to give our developers all of this information right from the version, it is important to document very well the changes you're making to the code. And this should be written in a way, these release notes should be written in a way that even a layman would understand. Developers using your code, they don't really care if you're in your CSS library, you changed this hex code to this hex code. What they really want to know is the purple is now showing up as the correct color purple, not blue purple. So yeah, I think it's good to use general language there. And finally, when we're talking about deployments, so a deployment versus a release, right? A release is you had some build that is going to be published somewhere. So that artifact is published somewhere and it can be downloaded by either other members of your team, by yourself, or by the public. A deployment is when things are getting to production. So taking one of those releases and promoting it to production. And to quote Dan Abramov, write a script to do your releases for you. So he uses the term releases here. We can replace that with deployments. So write a script to do your deployments for you. Get the CI to create automatic pre-releases from main, so you can always test the latest main in a code sandbox. A stable release should patch and promote a CI version, not build locally. And that's really important. The deployment on your release day should be the click of a button, or it should happen automatically. You shouldn't have to give any thought to it. You should maybe you monitor and just make sure everything went smoothly, and you can make fixes if you need to, but you shouldn't be doing this by hand. And that does just lead me to a quick story about something that I've been working on. So at the company with the team I work on, we've been releasing packages now internally to our company for a long time. And these packages are consumed by thousands of other developers, and they were deployed manually. And what this meant was we had to do a release candidate deployment the day before our release and an actual manual release on the day of. But our packages all depend on each other. So what that means is we have to deploy our first package and then deploy our second and third. And this resulted in the requirement of 2 developers taking 2 full days on a Thursday and a Friday. Their entire development day was spent doing these deployments. What I've done with first implementing a nightly release channel, so all of our builds end up getting released to this nightly channel. Now we can simply promote one of those nightly releases to production with the click of a button, saving 16 hours of 2 people. So it's 32 hours every 2 weeks. So back to 16 hours a week of time. And we all know how, important and valuable developer time is. So to save 16 hours every week, I think that really speaks to this quote here, or this quote here at least speaks to that it can really save a lot of time, headache, and money. So finally, here's some of those helpful links I talked about, right? We've got writing a good commit message and the semantic versioning spec. So I'll include these links to anybody who would like to check them out. And now I would like to open it up to questions.
Hey, Mike, this is Sid. Do you have any other resources that are, I don't know, like a Udemy course that is pretty good on the whole CI/CD process itself? I like what you talked about. I just want to know more sort of in depth or like a hands-on approach to deployment.
Yeah, there's some really good Udemy courses out there. Stephen Grider has a really good course on Udemy. You can search his name and CI/CD and find it. It'll probably be the first link there. They can get pretty in depth, and a lot of them are they're not very technology agnostic. So what I would do is take a technology you're either using already every day or something your team uses, and if you want to learn about that, find a course that specifically talks about those CI/CD tools, because each one's a little bit different, and a lot of the concepts carry over, but it can be nice to use something that'll be practical on day one.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Anything else?
Hey, Mike.
Go ahead.
Great talk. I had a question. What are your thoughts on adding, like, for example, security stages or anything related to like enforcing linting or static code analyzers as part of CI/CD?
Yeah. So first, I think security shouldn't be an afterthought. I think it should be implemented in each of these stages. And I could give 5 other talks on just security in each of those stages. So I do think that first, a lot of these things, since you can get very nitty-gritty with it, there's like a lot to talk about, but I do think it's important to implement security probably at every stage of the pipeline. This includes things like don't write any scripts that require. I mean, this is something I've seen more times than I care to admit, but it's don't have users store their password in plain text in another file so that you can use it in a shell script. I don't think that's the best idea, or ask them to add to their bash or make a bash alias of password with their password or anything like that. Those are some tips I would have there, but there's a lot more to security. You also mentioned the linting. I think that linting is very important. It's something that you should probably configure and have set up in a way such that definitely utilize tools like lint staged, which is a node package. If you're talking about JavaScript development, I'm sure there's other packages or extensions for things like this, but I think it's great to lint only the files that were changed when you're making that commit. And I do think depending on how long your linter is taking, if you can fit that in at the time of the commit before and do that locally, I think that's a really good practice.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I have a question for you, Mike. How would you get a team to start this? Let's say it's a product and a team that's already been coding for a while, but they don't really have a big CI/CD pipeline, or they don't develop with these mergeability concerns at front. What would be some tips to get them moving towards that direction? Like, how would you start? What first things would you do?
Yeah, so to answer this, I think the first thing I would do is look at the team, identify the pain point, right? Identify where CI/CD would come in handy, where automation would come in handy. Where are we wasting time, right? Like with my team, for example, the story I told, having 2 developers take 2 full days of work every 2 weeks to do a deployment that could have been automated, identify it and also volunteer to do it. And what will end up happening, I think, is other people are going first, get people excited about it, say, we're going to save so much time, right? This is going to be so much easier for you. I think it's once you kind of talk about all of the benefits and really focus on all of the benefits that you'll be gaining with automation of CI/CD, and all of these, and testing and all of these things, the more excited I think you seem, I think that typically rubs off really well on teammates. And what I've personally experienced is teammates asking to learn more. And I've done lunch and learns for my team, just saying, hey, here's how our nightly builds actually work. And people who had never even looked at, only knew Jenkins as, hey, that's the thing that approves my PR when it, when the build succeeds. Now they are writing their own Groovy files and asking me if I can set Jenkins jobs up for them. So I think your own enthusiasm can rub off.
Awesome. That's great advice. Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Nice. This is great, Mike. Toph, I know you have been building CI/CD pipelines for web as well as mobile for some time now. Do you want to add anything else? Any other tips for people or anything else?
No, I think he nailed a lot of the important points. Working on a lot of projects, we often see that developers aren't, um, sometimes they have sloppy commit messages, enforcing like conventional commit standards. Ultimately, these practices feed into the CI processes that Mike mentioned. So I think he nailed most of it. So that was perfect. Thank you, Mike.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Toph. Yeah, as somebody who's a developer who was told to take on some DevOps responsibilities, I appreciate the kind words. One thing that I wanted to mention during the presentation, if I've just got 30 seconds now, that I forgot and it just came to me, was it actually slipped my mind again. Oh man, no, commit messages. Okay, so when I was talking about release notes, just quick, if we can think back to what I was saying about release notes, having them be automatic, the way we can go about doing that can be in either inside of our commit messages. So if you use multi-line commits, sometimes there's conventions where we can encode into our commit messages something that will produce a nice looking release note for our end users. And if not in release notes, or I'm sorry, if not in commit messages, you can also do this inside of either like comments on a Jira ticket or whatever project management tool is being used. Typically, if you're using, all of these CI/CD tools and you have release notes, you're probably using something for project management. Anytime you can automate that, with a standard, okay, we're going to make a comment with, release note, and the type is going to be a bug fix. And I think that can go a long way. It takes maybe an afternoon to set up, and then you get these beautiful looking release notes automatically at every release. So that's yeah, it was supposed to be part of the talk. I had it written down and I didn't look at my notes. So
Good. Thanks for covering it, Mike. Anyone else? Any other questions, guys? Well, if not, then thanks, first of all, Mike, for such an excellent talk. And a reminder to all of you, we do these talks every Thursday at 5:15 p.m. Eastern time. And next week, Paul, who is here, he's an awesome engineer with us. He's going to go over GraphQL for web engineers. And GraphQL, as you guys know, it's a query language for APIs, which gives clients the power to ask for exactly what they need. And it makes it easier to evolve APIs over time. So I'm really looking forward to this talk. Make sure you mark your calendar for next week. Thank you all once again for joining. Have a wonderful evening, and I'll see you all next week.